Hi, Trey Clark here. In this video, I want to offer a brief review of an award-winning book on spiritual formation from an African American perspective. The book is entitled Soul Care in African American Practice, Soul Care in African American Practice, and it's written by the Reverend Dr. Barbara Peacock. Among other things, Dr. Peacock is an ordained minister, a spiritual director, an author, and the founder of Peacock Soul Care. Her book is a corrective to the ways in which the rich history of African American spiritual formation has largely been neglected in the scholarship of evangelical Christians. She has a Christocentric and Trinitarian emphasis throughout the book as she articulates the overlooked dimensions of prayer, spiritual direction, and soul care within the African American church. Her aim is really to show how these three things, prayer, spiritual direction, and soul care, are contextually embodied in African American practice. I want to offer a brief overview of the book, and I'd like to start with the opening chapter. It's in the opening chapter that she offers a survey of African American spirituality through tracing its roots to the continent of Africa. Dr. Peacock draws attention, even if briefly, to the diverse spiritual traditions that informed African peoples. Moreover, she highlights some of the North African theologians that were foundational in the early centuries of the Christian church, people like Augustine and Tertullian, Athanasius. In doing this, she really challenges the tendency of some to overlook the profound African influence on Christian theology and practice. However, ultimately, Dr. Peacock seeks to show how African American spirituality was forged in the midst of oppression and suffering and injustice as African peoples were brutally taken from the continent of Africa to what will be known as North America. Specifically, she suggests that the beginnings of African American spiritual direction and soul care can be found on slave ships during the Middle Passage to North America. She contends that in the midst of these oppressive conditions, a vibrant spirituality emerged as enslaved Africans creatively offered spiritual care to one another and ultimately found sustenance and hope in God. A God that she says often appeared to be different than the God espoused by their oppressors. With this brief history of African American spirituality in view, in the rest of the book, Dr. Peacock turns to explore prayer, spiritual direction, and soul care in 10 African American exemplars in the past as well as in the present. She organizes her treatment of these exemplars into two different sections. The first is a section on spiritual direction and spiritual disciplines. And the second is a section on what she calls prayer disciplines. Now, in this video, I can't offer a full examination of the many exemplars that Dr. Peacock considers, but I do want to draw attention to three themes that stood out to me as I engaged her book. The first thing that really stood out to me is that Dr. Peacock shows how spiritual direction has been contextualized to the particularities of African American experiences. She makes the intriguing case that the use of the term soul care rather than spiritual direction may be less of a barrier to African Americans, given the common usage of the term soul in the Black community. Compelling examples of African American spiritual direction are also highlighted as she begins to discuss the practice of spiritual direction. She looks at some contemporary spiritual directors such as Daryl Griffin as well as Jessica Ingram. A second theme that stood out to me in the book is that Dr. Peacock articulates the intersection of prayer and social concern in African American spiritual formation. For her, prayer not only nurtures intimacy with Christ, but it also energizes social action. While further concrete elaboration on contemplation and action would be something that some might find welcome and intriguing, Dr. Peacock does note that this is a theme that appears vividly in the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, as well as Dr. Harold Carter. A third and final theme that I'd highlight that shows up in the book is that African American spiritual practice is embodied in the context of suffering and injustice. Dr. Peacock proposes several examples here. For instance, she claims that Frederick Douglass engaged in a kind of Lectio Divina while learning to read as an enslaved person. She also points to Rosa Parks, who practiced, she says, meditation and contemplation while she was being threatened on a segregated bus. Another example of an exemplar that Dr. Peacock lifts up is Howard Thurman. She says Thurman was one who sought mystical connection with God in the midst of a racialized society. Dr. Peacock goes on to suggest that contemplative practices are still being done in the midst of suffering, injustice, and oppression today, and that the struggle for equality, or we might say equity, continues. In the conclusion of her book, she draws attention to the universal yet particular ways that the Holy Spirit works in African American contexts. She also points to the importance of stillness for formation. And then thirdly, she looks at the living legacy of prayer, spiritual direction, and soul care in African American practice. As you can tell, I think this is a really important book. It's been meaningful in my own life. Her book is really one of the few books that explores prayer, spiritual direction, and soul care from a decidedly African American perspective that is also Christocentric and Trinitarian. Her work is distinguished by her survey of diverse African American women and men in the past and the present, while also being in conversation with several European American spiritual formation writers, such as Eugene Peterson or Ruth Haley Barton, as well as Richard Foster. As a result, really, Soul Care in African American Practice is a book that helps to shed light on an understudied dimension of the history and practice of spiritual formation in the global church, while using some of the language of the broadly evangelical Christian spiritual formation movement. Dr. Peacock's inclusion of engaging spiritual exercises such as Visio Divina as well as Lectio Divina, as well as questions at the questions for reflection at the end of each chapter, is especially an important contribution that is valuable. Additionally, she introduces some African American spiritual exemplars that many might be unfamiliar with. Of course, with any book, there are inevitable challenges, especially a brief book. Some folks might want to go deeper in looking at the spiritual biographies of Frederick Douglass or Dr. Renita Weems or Howard Thurman to look at their varied spirituality and its various textures and more depth. Readers may also find themselves wanting more direct engagement with some of the seminal scholarship on African American spirituality by scholars such as Albert Roboteau or Peter Paris or Diana Hayes. Still, Soul Care in African American Practice is an important work, a valuable work for a general audience. If you are looking for a clear and easy read that introduces you to various African American spiritual exemplars and practices, this is really the book for you. Spiritual directors, pastors, students of spiritual formation will particularly find it an illuminating treatment of prayer, spiritual direction, and soul care from an African American perspective. It's really a must-read book for people of all backgrounds, a book that really witnesses to the resilience, the creativity, and the spiritual wisdom in the life and practices of African Americans trusting God in the past as well as in the present. Go check out the book. Well, thanks so much for watching this video. If you found something in the video helpful, feel free to like it, share it, and subscribe to this channel for more content. Until next time, blessings.